church, you can be seated and let's grab our Bibles. Let's take them and let's turn to the book of Job. As we are now in our third message in the book of Job from this little mini-series that we are calling When Your World is Turned Upside Down. We are each week looking at the troubles and the trials and the hardships that Job encountered so that we, like him, can think about how we should look at our trials, how we should think about those things, and really how we should respond when our world is turned upside down. And again, I want to remind you, it's not that you can only learn from the story of Job if you encounter the same kind of troubles and trials. That is probably not going to happen in your life, thank God. But whatever your trials are, whatever your troubles are, whatever the things are that you just wished would go away, they are there by God's design so that you might learn some incredible lessons. And it seems to me, I was thinking this morning, again, as I think through our congregational attendance, that God is obviously giving circumstances for people to find themselves in moments of unwanted Sunday mornings, right? So I get a call this morning about people being sick, running fevers all of a sudden. We can't make it. I get a call from one who is experiencing kidney stones this morning, so they can't make it. And then that unwanted and unanticipated and really undesirable moment in Tim Henderson's life where his stepfather-in-law passes away last night. So it's like God keeps providing for us opportunity throughout our congregation. And I don't know all your stories and what's going on in your morning this morning, but I do know that God has given you this good book called Job, this gift from heaven above, so that you might process through that and think in a way that is absolutely the way God is showing us in the life of Job. So let's just remind ourselves of, real quickly, a couple of things we've learned to bring us to chapter 2 this morning. We talked about Job's character when his world got turned upside down. And if you remember, it tells us that this was a man who was blameless, not sinless. So just note again, that means that Job was a genuine believer. He was a follower of God. Nothing about his life is demanding or would make you even think that what's about to unfold in verse 6 was because of something he did wrong or didn't do. And that's why we've kept that quote before us from Don Carson, who says the emphasis on Job's goodness is meant to highlight the fact that there is such a thing as innocent suffering. This means that not all suffering is directly related to a specific sin. It means that some suffering in this world is not directly related to any sin. Now listen, if you don't have, as I said before, your best theology, your best thinking from the Bible in the times of suffering, you will go there immediately and you will think that there is something you have done wrong or something you could have done better. But Job is a reminder that there is in our life the potential that we can suffer, not because of a specific sin or because of any sin we have done, but because of God's sovereign design. And so our first lesson we took away from that is there is such a thing as innocent suffering. It's just something that has come into your life and it's not tied directly to anything you have done or should have done better. The second thing is we moved on in chapter 1 to verses 6 through the end of chapter 1. We looked at what happened when Job got the worst news of his life. And his conflict is recorded for us in those verses there. And those things are reminding us as this conversation took place in heaven between God and Satan. By the way, a conversation that Job was clueless of. You just got to put yourself in that position. You read the Bible, you know the story, and you know what's going on behind the scenes. But Job had no clue at all. But on that day, as verse 6 unfolds, his happy day moved to a horrible day. And it was a day that he lost everything he had, including his 10 children. And as Christopher Ash reminds us in his commentary on Job, in some deep way, it is necessary for it to be publicly seen by the whole universe that God is worthy of the worship of a man and that God's worth is in no way dependent on God's gifts. If there's a second lesson that you learned from Job chapter 1, and that is sometimes we need to remind ourselves that the glory of God is more important than your or my or Job's comfort. Job is telling us that in this story. What mattered most is the Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And so this is a very, very important lesson. Two things so far. There is such a thing as innocent suffering, and in that suffering that makes no sense to you, you and I need to rivet our souls heavenward so that we remember that our aim is to bless God, to put the attention on Him, to give Him glory, or we will find ourselves in that trial with all kind of confusion, all kind of questions and struggles that will sink us further than possibly the trouble we are finding ourselves in. Now that moves us on now to chapter 2. And in chapter 2, I want you to notice that another conversation begins. Chapter 2, verse 1. Again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them to present himself before the Lord. Now that sounds very familiar, doesn't it, to the conversation of chapter 1 between God and Satan. And yet there is something you need to note in this conversation, and it is the word again. Well, what it tells you is that we have seen Job suffer in chapter 1. We have watched him realize that there is such a thing as innocent suffering. We have seen Job respond for the glory of God and care about God getting the attention and the focus more than himself in his suffering. And you and I would be tempted as the reader of this story, and you might even be tempted in looking at other people and the suffering they go through to say, are you kidding me? Isn't that enough? Job has proven to the onlooking world and millions of readers who will read this story that he is a godly man, that suffering can happen not because you did something wrong or you should have done something better or more, and that when you do, you put your focus on the glory of God. Surely we should say Job ends right here in chapter 1, verse 22. And yet we enter chapter 22 with this word again. And it unfolds for us another conversation that is going to take place when Satan comes along with the other angels to present themselves before God. And remember, this presentation is a call to accountability. This is a reminder in Job in both conversations that not only the good angels are before God giving an account, but even Satan himself is accountable to God. He is not a free agent running around messing with Job. Satan himself is as well under the divine control and sovereignty and accountability to the God of the universe. So again, a conversation is going to unfold. And this heavenly conversation takes place where this day unfolds. And again, he doesn't know about this conversation. Another thing you might want to note between chapter 1 and chapter 2, we do not know how long it was between that first conversation and Satan going after Job and him losing all his stuff to this second conversation. There is no way we can know the time frame between these two events. But knowing enough of the Bible as we do, I can pretty much assure you, and I would think that'd be a really good conclusion to come to, that it wasn't long between the first and the second attack. And here is why. Because Satan is an adversary. That's what his name means, the adversarial one, the prosecutor. When he sees that things have not gone the way that he intended in the first case, he is going to quickly come back and go after Job. Again, I think that's just the very nature of his diabolical, scheming heart and mind. You know him well enough to know that when one of us is down, that's when he wants to hit you again and again and again. He's not gracious and kind and saying, let me give you a little break here and kind of get your feet on the ground. No, he's the kind of evil opponent to God and God's people that when you are down, this is a prime time for him to hammer you once again. So I don't think there was much of a lapse between this first conversation and what this conversation records is that the horror is going to continue. This heavenly conversation takes place, as we said, just like in verse 1. And this conversation is going to unfold a suffering for Job that is distinct and different from chapter 1. You see, in chapter 1, he lost his stuff, and yes, he lost his children. But in this one, it's going to take on a different look, and that is, it's not going to be about stuff, but his own personal body, his own personal life. And it's not just going to be the day of getting bad news. It's going to be the day of this struggle going on and on and on. In fact, the rest of the book of Job is going to unfold with the ongoing troubles he is going to have in this situation. So it's important to keep this heavenly conversation in your mind and realize, if you'll look at your Bible, chapter 2, that in verse 10, this is how Job is going to end this ongoing, unending, unrelieved suffering in his life. He says in verse 10, look it down at the middle of the verse, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? That's where we're going to end today. That's where we're going to conclude this little mini-series of these 2 chapters on when our world is turned upside down. And I asked myself the question all week long, how in the world did Job, not only in chapter 1, say, blessed be the name of the Lord, but in this ending of this suffering that's not going to end in a day, that's going to go on and on, how did he get himself to a place to where he could say, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? How could he come to that place? What I see here is that Job is entering now a valley. It's not just a moment, and I've called it the valley of despair. It will go on and on and on. And in this valley of despair, that response of accepting good from God as well as adversity is the heart of a worshiper in the valley of his despair. And I'm thinking, how in the world does Job get there? What is it that leads him to offer up, as it were, a monument of praise and worship to God in the midst of not just one day's trouble, but trouble that goes on and on and on? I think that's a pretty good question for us to try to settle this morning and figure out how he got there. And what got me thinking about this was a story I read, a true story. How I ran across this, I don't know, other than in God's providence, he let me read this story, because this is not the kind of stuff I typically read from Enterprise, Alabama, okay? But I was reading this story about the citizens and farmers of Enterprise, Alabama, who had a deep problem. The story goes like this. Their entire economy rested on successfully growing cotton, as all the farmers did in and around Enterprise, Alabama. This was before a small beetle finally somehow made it all the way from Mexico in 1892 to Alabama by 1915. A few years later, all the cotton fields were literally eaten by this little bug that was officially called the Anthemonus grandis, otherwise known as the boll weevil. All the farmers were facing bankruptcy and the rest of the town with them, except one farmer who saw this boll weevil destroying everything as an opportunity. Rather than pack his bags and surrender to the pest and that had arrived in swarms and loved to eat cotton, he decided to plant another crop. He had heard of another Alabama man who had convinced a number of people that peanuts could be a cash crop. Many did not believe this man, and what would a former slave like him working in a school for former children of slaves in Alabama know about peanuts, even if his name was after a former president? His name was George Washington Carver. The farmer in Enterprise, Alabama had nothing to lose and everything to gain, so he planted peanuts. He was the only farmer who did. We can imagine the stares and whispers. The article goes on to say that he endured. At the end of that year, his crop was so prosperous that he paid off all his debts, put money in his pockets, and the next year, not surprisingly, all the farmers followed suit. They never looked back. Today, nearly $4 billion a year are made from peanuts. We eat 700 million pounds of peanut butter every single year, and I probably eat most of that at my house for sure. But this is where the story became applicable to Job to me. Mr. Fleming, a local businessman in Enterprise, Alabama, came up with the idea to build a monument dedicated to thanking the very bug that made them prosperous. Now, for nearly 100 years, a monument sits at the intersection of College and Main Street in Enterprise, Alabama. This monument stands more than 30 feet in the air, and at the top is a woman whose looks were similar to the Statue of Liberty. She was crafted in Italy and shipped to Alabama in her flowing gown. With her arms raised high, she holds, and I want to get a little closer on this picture here, a platter in her hands And on top is this large imitation of the most famous Beatle in the world. I'm not talking about John Lennon, okay? This boll weevil is at the center of the town. What gets even more interesting in this true story in Enterprise, Alabama, is that they dedicated it on December the 11th, 1919, and here's what the plaque on their street says. In profound appreciation of the boll weevil and what it has done as the herald of prosperity, this monument is erected by the citizens of Enterprise, Coffee County, Alabama. And brothers and sisters, if a boll weevil can change your perspective, surely the God you've been singing to this morning can do that. In the midst of your valley of despair, in the midst of that which is eating away at you, that just seems like your whole world is going to collapse and fall apart, maybe like that one farmer, you might make the decision to see it as an opportunity. And an opportunity to erect, as it were, a monument of worship to the God that you claim to belong to. That I and you would be able to look at that and say, that which was intended to destroy us, God has used it for our good. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Shall we not receive good from him as well as adversity and hold that monument up, that trouble up in such a way that it magnifies him like never before? Now, that's what we want to get to today. And that's what we want to understand. And the question is, how did Mr. Job get there? How did he get to a place of contentment? Well, let's walk through these verses and we'll see rather quickly what happened and how he got there. We've already talked about the meeting in heaven, this scene that takes place. And you need to know that in verses 1 through 3, when we read that on that day when Satan came also with the other angels to present himself before the Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Now, you need to know that God is not asking this question of Satan because God doesn't know where he is. It is not like somehow God's GPS system kind of got messed up that day and he's looking for Satan and he doesn't know where he is. There's this omni thing about God that lets us know that that's not why he's asking the question, and that is called his omniscience. He sees everything, every move, every thought, everything. Never escapes his notice. So he's not asking Satan because he's uninformed. This is a rhetorical question very similar to the question that God asked Adam after they had sinned when he went looking for them in the garden. He knew where they were, right? But he asked them the question, "Where are you?" And what the question is designed for is to bring accountability. To bring him back to the place to where he realizes that really I owe an explanation to this God. And he asks him a second question, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And if you look in those verse 3, he's talking about again for the third time how righteous Job is, how godly this man is. And this is a rhetorical question. I mean, you know Satan has considered Job. You know that's true. I mean, that would be like asking a teenage boy, "Have you ever considered girls?" I mean, you don't have to, he doesn't have to give you an answer. You know the answer, right? And so Satan has been considering Job. He has been looking at him. And God reminds him and us the third time in verse 3 that there is no one like this man, blameless and upright, fearing God and turning away from evil. And he still, in light of what happens in chapter 1, still holds fast his integrity, although you incited me against him to ruin him without cause. You might just want to rephrase that little phrase about "you incited me," because it reads better if you put it and render it this way, "and you incite me against him without cause." That's the idea. There was no grounds. There was no sin in his life. There was nothing he could have and should have done better. He literally has passed the test. And so the question rhetorically is, you considered him? He said, yes, I've considered him for sure. He has. And so Satan begins these ruthless accusations in verses 4 through 6. And so Satan answered the Lord and said, "Skin for skin. Skin for skin. Yes, all that a man has, he will give for his life." Now, what he's saying to him, again, in these ruthless accusations, and he's, as it were, pointing his finger in the face of God and saying, yeah, it's one thing for people to let go of their stuff. I mean, maybe even their kids. But if you start touching him, you take his skin, you take the stuff that really touches him, he will curse you to your face. You'll really see now, he is saying to God, that he is a fake. He is a fraud. He's not a real follower of you at all. I mean, it's one thing to let your stuff go, but it's another thing to let something touch you personally. It's what one writer compared to Queen Elizabeth I as she was on her deathbed in 1603. She said, all my possessions for just a moment of time. That's what he's saying to them. He'll give up everything as long as he can keep his life. And so you think that as Satan said to God, you let Job be brought to the point of death and he'll trade away his precious faith. That's what's going to unfold. And it is in verse 5. However, put forth your hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you to your face. And again, we are shocked. We are somewhat shocked as the readers to read verse 6, because we could think that God could say he's already passed the test. He's already proven that he is a genuine follower of me. But verse 7 or verse 6, so the Lord said to Satan, behold, he is in your power, only spare his life. So, this scene where the meeting in heaven takes place changes now to the scene on earth in verses 7 through 9. And this scene on earth is a scene of misery. There's a scene of misery here. And I think there are at least 4 things that cause great misery and grief to Job in this suffering to his own personal life that you and I think, will identify with, and we'll see why this ongoing kind of suffering like this becomes one of the biggest trials for Job and will endure through the rest of the book of Job. Notice, if you will, in verse 7. Then Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and he smote Job. Now, this is really important to catch. The text says that after this conversation, this heavenly meeting, then the scene on earth transpires this way: when Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and you need to underscore the phrase, smote Job. Now, what this is telling us that this attack from Satan is a direct personal attack from Satan. You say, well, I thought in chapter 1 he did that. Yeah, he did, but he was behind it in chapter 1, orchestrating people and things to bring suffering to Job. Now it ups the ante in that it goes from him orchestrating people and things to he personally is going to touch Job and put his finger on him. That's why it says, he went out from the presence of the Lord and smote Job. This attack in chapter 2 is a direct attack. This is a direct attack. And this attack, as we see, secondly, is an attack that goes on in verse 7 to show us that it's a physical attack. You need to underscore 2 phrases there when it says in verse 7 that he smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. This is physical suffering. This is personal. He's got Job in his scope. He has got him in his target range, and he goes after him, and this becomes physical. The phrase there, the sore boils, by the way, is actually the same plague and the same word that is used later on when the children of Israel are in Egypt, and they experience, I should say, the Egyptians experience one of the 10 plagues called boils. This is, as it were, a constant ulcerous sore that will ooze constantly out of Job's life and body. This meant Job could not stand without pain, and he could not sit down, even lie down, without aggravating these boils. It is excruciating, uncomfortable, ongoing pain. Now let me just say something to you about sickness. All of us get sick from time to time, and that's one thing. But sickness that never ends is quite another level of suffering. It's quite another torment to go through. Because when we get sick, we're looking down the road after we've done our antibiotics, after we've done the things that we need to do to rest, and we're all good, and we're back, and we're going on with life again. But that's not going to happen for Job. This is unending physical pain in his life. And you'll remember in our R4G meeting when I was preaching that night about discouragement, one of the causes of discouragement is physical suffering and sickness. The woman of the issues of 12 years of having that blood issue and others like who were brought by their friend to come meet Jesus who were suffering. In each of those cases, Jesus says, be of courage. Why would he say be of courage to them? Because they are so discouraged about the ongoing, unrelenting, non-stop physical troubles. And so just a lesson for us, if you're trying to encourage someone and deal with someone who has ongoing pain and suffering, it's just a good reminder that there is no quick answer or fix. There is solutions. Job will discover those. We'll see those as we move through the book. But you and I need to know that this is not a just flip the light switch moment and it's over. Job is experiencing not only personal attack by Satan, but physical pain in his life. Now, I just want to give you a preview, because though you read that he was having these sore boils from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head, covering him, you might not get the real picture of how bad this was for Job until you read the rest of the book of Job. And I'm pretty sure most of you wouldn't read the rest of the book of Job from chapter 3 on for a lot of reasons. It's just hard reading in one sense. Just seems to keep going on and on and on and telling stories and things that doesn't make sense to us sometimes. But if you were to go forward in chapter 3, you would find that this kind of suffering that Job is going through in chapter 3 relates to him not being able to eat. He can't even eat. He's so sick. In chapter 3, he goes on and talks about an overwhelming sense of dread and fear that just comes on him. In chapter 7, Job said, when I lie down, I say, when shall I arise? But the night continues, and I am continually tossing until dawn. We call that insomnia. He can't eat. He's got fear going on. He can't sleep. In chapter 7, he talks about the worms, and those are probably what are growing and festering out of the sores that are in his body. In chapter 7, he talks about having hardened skin that cracked and oozed with pus. Chapter 9, he has difficulty breathing. Chapter 16, he has deep circles around his eyes, and Plexiderm is not going to fix this. In chapter 19 and 33, he talks about he's losing weight. In chapter 30, he has constant, continual pain. Job says in chapter 30, days of affliction have seized me. At night it pierces my bones in me, and my gnawing pain takes no rest. In chapter 30, he says, I go about mourning without comfort. And in verse 30, he adds, my bones burn with fever. I mean, no wonder, brothers and sisters, when we come to the next section of Job and his friends show up, they didn't even recognize the guy. This is incredible physical pain that Satan has targeted him with. Now, let me give a little note of importance here. That is not to say in your physical pain that every time you get sick, that's the devil. It may be a part of just brokenness in this world and the fallenness that which we all have in our bodies as a result of sin entering and death following. But we do know specifically in this story that this is not just about normal life in this world. This is a direct, personal attack of physical suffering in Job's life. But yet it's not over. There's more to the misery. Not just that it's a personal attack by Satan, and not just that it's a physical attack. The third thing is it's a very painful attack. We've already seen that in the verses that we read. But notice here that he takes a piece of broken potsherd, like a broken pot, to scrape himself while he was sitting among the ashes. Now that should show you how painful this is. Where is Job? Is he laying at home with hospice care, clean sheets, somebody waiting on him, bringing him his meds? No. He is on the outskirts of town like everybody else who has leprosy or some disease like this, so that he cannot come around anybody. He is sitting out at the trash dump. That's what that phrase, sitting among the ashes, is referring to. It's where you take your garbage. It's where you throw out the stuff that's refuge and you burn it so that it is nothing but ashes left there. That is where Job finds himself. And in the midst of sitting in the trash dump, he finds a piece of a broken pot and he tries to itch himself just to relieve the painful irritation that is going on in his life. It's a persistent itching that will not stop. Warren Wiersbe describes this so vividly, so let me read it to you. He says, towns in the Middle East had a landfill, a city dump outside the gates, where garbage and sewage were dumped. Periodically, the rotting garbage would be burned as a way of sanitation. To be sitting among the ashes was to be sitting nearby garbage and the dung heap. This was the place where beggars foraged for scraps of food, where dogs fought for something to eat. This was the city's sewer disposal site, and there Job sat in the ashes of a recent fire. Try to picture this. Job's face, his hands, his feet, and every other part of him that could be seen through his torn clothing were oozing with open sores. His eyes were swollen from crying, and the dark circles around his eyes made him look demented. His clothes were caked with mud and blood. The bones in his shoulder blades poked through the dirty cloak. His breath was short and strained, his face gaunt with the lack of food. There Job sat, who was earlier introduced to us as, in chapter 1, the greatest of all the men of the East. There sits the great man, hunched over and rocking back and forth with despair and weeping, at times oblivious to the dogs and the beggars and the lepers. He was only making his misery worse with his incessant scratching with the blunt edge of a broken piece of pottery, trying to bring some moment of relief from his agony. That's what the writer wants us to enter into, to see is going on with Job. But of all three things so far that brought misery to him, a personal attack by Satan, a physical attack that he had to endure, and a physical attack that was painful, the final and the last one has to be, in my opinion, the most painful one of all. And that is in verse 9, where we see Job's misery now as a private misery. Notice that it says in that verse, his wife speaks up now for the first time, and she said, "Do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die." Now, I don't want to be too hard on Mrs. Job here, okay? So just track with me for just a moment. I get it that she has seen horrific suffering over the last few days. She has watched, just like Job, all their stuff is gone, and 10 precious children are gone. She's looking at those same 10 freshly dug graves around their house. I get it that she is in pain like you can only imagine. And now she sees the only one she has left, the one she is called to be one flesh with, suffering excruciating, ongoing, nonstop, unexplainable pain in his life. And she can't be with him because he's out there with the rest of the outcast. So I'm sympathetic. I am very sympathetic with what she says. And yet, I think the writer of Job has something deeper to remind us of. You see, God has designed that Mrs. Job, like every wife, is one with her husband. And if you notice in the verses that follow, when he says, "Shall we not accept good and accept evil?" he is saying, we are partners. We are in this hardship together. It's not just you, it's us. That's us. So as a partner, we need to do this thing together. In fact, you know the phrase, right, that the Bible used to describe a wife. She is called a helper. And by the way, that same Hebrew word is used in the Psalms when David speaks of God and says, "The Lord God is my helper." And what that means is, I can't make it without God, my helper. And in marriage, the same ideal and design is this: I cannot make it through life without you. I need you. You're a helper. But at this moment, Mrs. Job, in her stress and in her overwhelmed moment, is not really serving as the helper. Douglas O'Donnell writes it this way: A man often feels most helpless when his helpmate helps not. And Christopher Ashe says, but whatever her motive, she is the mouthpiece of a terrible temptation, what Augustine calls the devil's assistant and Calvin referred to as Satan's tool. She is asking Job to do what Satan wants him to do, which is curse God and die. Ladies, can I just have your attention for just a moment and tell you how important you are to your man, and the troubles and the trials and the unexplained, ongoing things that come into his life? Are you that critical to him? To be the helper, not to be the tool of the adversary, but to be the helper. Really prize that role. Give yourself to that role in those hardships. It will mean the incredible world to your man. I promise you that. And men, can I tell you this? If you got a woman like that, you need to praise her from sun up to sundown. You need to thank the Lord that there ain't no woman like the one I got. Because that's a rare jewel. A rare jewel. So Mrs. Job, and what she said, kind of leaves Job sitting on the garbage dump, and all of his pain, all of his misery, all of his suffering, privately alone by himself. How is Job going to respond to this? This is where we close this morning. He's responding with contentment, right? And he has a message for us in verse 10. He says, you speak, talking to his wife, as one of the foolish women. Now let's be careful here. He didn't call her a fool, okay? He didn't call her a fool. What he says is, you're speaking like one of those women. Mr. Job, in all of his suffering, is looking at her and saying, baby, this is not like you. You're not that kind of woman. But you're speaking in your stress just like one of those foolish women who do not know God and don't care about wanting to please God. And he included her when he says, you speak as a woman speaks. Shall we, me and you together, we're partners, indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? No doubt, Mr. and Mrs. Job had had days of conversation sitting around in their property and together as a husband and wife, looking at their kids, looking at the blessings that God had given them and all the stuff that was around them. No doubt they had had a conversation and said, isn't God so good to us? Look how he has been so kind to us and blessed us. We don't deserve this. This is not something we've earned, but God is so good. And yet they forgot he's not only a good God, but he's a God that will send adversity. Though he is not the instrument, he's not the one who literally put his hand on Job and made him sick. He is in sovereign control of all that unfolded, both of those scenes in Job's life. They had had this conversation about God's blessing, but in the suffering, Mrs. Job lost her perspective, and her words had to be the most painful of all things that Job heard. So we conclude with this little mini-series in Job about our world being turned upside down by seeing how Job ends. And all this, verse 10, Job did not sin with his lips. Now that's the end. And yet I think there's one more message I want us to talk about here regarding accepting the good and the adversity. And it has to do with some important lessons that we learned from this little mini series we've done, and to deal with some of the hard questions that we still haven't addressed when it comes to sovereign suffering. But that's next week or some week. We'll do that. Right now, I want to draw your conclusion to what I think Job would say to you if he could come sit beside you this morning, or to you who are watching by live stream, and he could sit down with you at your house and put his arm around you. This is what he would say to you. He would tell you what really true biblical prosperity is like. Now, we hear a lot about prosperity and prosperity preaching in our culture, which tends to be, if you love God, follow him, he'll give you all this great stuff. But that's not biblical prosperity. When Job in this verse says to his wife, shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity from. The idea of from God means what God gives us. It's about prosperity, about what God has blessed us with or put into our lives. And so this phrase here, God has given us, and even in verse 21 of chapter 1, he uses a similar language when he says the Lord gave us. He's talking about how biblical prosperity should be thought of. Now listen very carefully. The opening story about Mr. Job and all his stuff, and the way this section ends in chapter 2, verse 10, is a strong reminder to us of what real prosperity is. Real biblical prosperity is not in any way tied to your stuff. It's tied to a sovereign God. And so the conclusion of what Job is telling us here is that biblical prosperity is growing richer in our knowledge and our love of God. If in your trial, if in that thing that you just wished would go away, you find that God is taking that to increase your knowledge about him, to teach you more of who he is and what he is like, and you love him more and you desire his glory more, you have just gotten the most amazing, prosperous gift God could ever give you. That's not the way a culture thinks. That is not the way we think in our fallen flesh. But if Job could come into your world and Job could sit beside you, he would put around you his arm, and Job would say, you know, there really is such a thing as innocent suffering. And you know that there is this thing to where when you're suffering, God's glory matters more than what you're going through. And you know there is this treasure, this precious blessing that we have from God, that we have this knowledge of who he is and love him more, not because of stuff, but because of who he is. And I wonder this morning as we close, as you think back on something of your world and your life and your experience, if you've really come to see this is the greatest treasure God could ever give you. I wonder if currently right now as you sit here this morning or you're watching this message, if whatever you're currently going through, you are able to raise that monument of praise, to build that thing that you could lift up, not a bow weevil, not a thing that like that, but your trouble and your trial, and say, let this be a monument of praise to my God right now. That knowing him and loving him is the most valuable thing. I want people to see that wherever they come in my life. Maybe this week you received news that you thought you'd never hear. Something was told to you, something changed in your life that you never thought would happen. The monument of praise, like Job, we all want to offer up, whether we're looking at the past, we're looking currently at something, or just right now, we just heard something. Is to be what Job was. And a monument of praise to say the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Shall we indeed accept good from God and not accept adversity? You lift that monument up like that, you're going to be an amazing testimony to the God that you belong to. People might not drive to Enterprise, Alabama to see that statue, but they will come to see something in you that they've never seen before. And that is a God that you love and you worship in the valley of despair. May it be said of us as it was of Job, in all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Let's pray.